Hello there and welcome. It's Morgana here with today's tutorial. Today I will be demonstrating for you this beautiful lakeside scene with a lone little egret and some lovely elegant pine trees. This is the sketch I began with. You can see I've just roughed everything out on paper. The most important thing to capture is our little egret silhouette, which I have filled in using Sepia drawing gum. This will protect the white of the paper as I paint so that we can make sure we get a lovely little white bird at the end of it. So the colours I used today are up on the screen at the moment. I'll also pop a list in the video description below. You can see I've just popped a strip of masking tape along where the horizon line is, just to protect that so I can get a nice clean line. And now I'm putting in a little wash of just clear water and going to do the sky first. So for the sky today, I've mixed up on my palette a little bit of indigo and some cerulean blue just to lift it up a little bit, give it that extra little pale oomph, because indigo on its own can be lovely and dark, but a little bit more moody than I wanted for this one. So you can see it's a very light mix of paint. Then I'm just putting on with my large wash brush. This is a 2-inch flat synthetic wash brush from Daler Rowney. And it's doing an admirable job. I'm just going to pull the paint around a little bit. I don't want too complex a sky, but we want a little bit of movement in there, a little bit of life. It's the impression of and hint of some drifting clouds, some patches of dark and light, just to add a bit of interest behind the trees we're going to put in later. As you can see, because the paper is wet that I'm putting the paint onto, we're starting to get some diffusion here. Where I'm putting the lines in, they're not staying too hard, they're sort of softening into the water that's already on the paper. So you can move it about a little bit, add in some more, as you can see I'm doing here, and just whilst the paper is wet you get this window of opportunity to just move the colour around and to just get a little bit of extra movement and life in there just while the paper's wet. And as I keep painting, as the paper begins to dry, it's going to continue to soften down just a little bit and diffuse as it dries. So that's our sky done. Now I'm going to put in a little bit of extra into the background. Some rich paint here. This is a little bit of indigo mixed with a touch of Perylene Green. This is going to be our distant forest in the background. So all it really needs to be is a smudge on the horizon. So as you can see, I'm smudging away here, putting in some generic sort of shapes, softening down the top of the smudge to give it a nice silhouette. Give us the hint of perhaps of the tops of some conifers poking out, that little impression of a distant forest. You can see this rich paint that I've put on here is already softening up into the skyline, which is the idea of putting it on whilst the paper is still wet from doing the sky. We want a nice soft diffused background which gives us that impression of distance and a little nice little touch of mistiness. And now that's done, just pulling the protective tape away, so just removing any excess water and paint that's dribbled down the sides there, so we keep our nice clean line. You can see we've got a lovely straight line on the horizon there. Doesn't matter too much for the where I'm putting in the foreground, the sort of smudgy sort of plains area where the trees are growing. But I wanted a nice crisp line for where the lake disappears into the horizon. So now I'm using a smaller fret brush to just start to pop in a little bit of clean water again, and I'm going to start bringing a little bit of colour into the foreground. And I'm sticking with the same colours that I've already used. We want a nice similarity, a nice sort of lovely sense of balance and colour matching here. I'm using again Indigo and Perylene Green. I'm just going to start dotting that around this space on the left hand side, which is leading into the foreground of the painting. Now just trying to be a little bit careful, bringing the colour along the horizon line and then bringing it down into the foreground. I'm being quite just careful along the lakeshore, just making sure I get that shape right, following the pencil lines that I've already popped in. I'm not worrying too much about getting this foreground wash very smooth. I want a little bit of interesting colour and texture in there to give the impression of sort of high and low ground, different sort of shapes and shades of grass there. I just want the colours to all harmonise really nicely. I think as we've got the indigo running through everything so far, I think we are getting that. There you go, just smudging in a little bit of extra darker paint. This is some more indigo going in here. As you can see, we've already wetted this part of the paper, and so again we're able to just slap this paint on, and it's softening down almost straight away and blending in really nicely. Now I'm just using a damp brush. I've cleaned off my brush, dried it mostly, and now I'm just pulling the paint out of where you can see it was starting to bloom upwards into the distant tree line there. So I'm sort of almost drying the paper here by running a only slightly damp brush across it here. I'm sort of pulling out some of the water and the paint, and I'm stopping it from blooming upwards and potentially forming a cauliflower, getting that sort of hard watery edge. Let's just soften that down a little bit and prevented that. Plus it means we get this nice misty line across the left side there, a little bit, a hint of drifting mist up from the lake perhaps. And you can see as well, I hopped forward a little bit and just did exactly the same technique as I just showed you to fill in the right side of the foreground of the lakeshore. You can see it's the same colours, just filling in with the flat brush, edging around the lakeshore and just getting some interesting mottled colour and texture. And now all I'm doing is using the flat brush again to bring a bit of colour into the lake. I wanted to keep it nice and pale, so I'm using a touch of Cerulean Blue, which is the same blue that we used in the sky, mixed with a tiny touch of Indigo, just to bring down that really vibrant bright blue that you get with cerulean. It's a really vibrant sort of a summer colour to me, at least. So just bringing that down with a touch of Indigo and using a really pale wash here just to put in the impression of a lovely glowing still lake, perhaps reflecting that beautiful sky that we've got drying above. And now just using a slightly darker colour, still very light, but you can see I've added a little bit of darker paint here and a touch of green, just give the impression of some reflections of that distant forest, just drawing it down into the waters of the lake there. Right, now I've left that to dry, so this entire painting is dry now. You can see we've got those lovely colours. They've softened back a little bit, that watercolour tends to. They always look a touch paler once they're dry than they do when you're painting them, which is something to always bear in mind. But now that it's dry, I'm going to put in a few tree silhouettes into this background. So we've got this lovely soft misty background that we created here with the wet on wet diffusion. So all I'm doing is using a small round brush and some really dilute paint, and I'm going to begin filling in the outlines of some conifers, some lovely fir trees, pine trees, spruce trees, all that sort of good stuff. So again, using Perylene Green with a touch of Indigo, but mixed with a lot of water. You can see it looks like it's going on quite dark here, that's because of the water, but as it dries it will fade and soften back, and it will look like part of this lovely misty backdrop and just look like a forest in the distance rising up through the mist. I'm just going to do a goodly row of trees along the back here. Going to try and vary the shape and the size of them, and just give that impression of this lovely deep inviting forest looming in the background. And you can use any brush you like to do this, whichever feels comfortable for you. I'm using a round brush here, but you could just as easily use a small flat brush, would give you some lovely texture, some lovely shape, or a small mop brush, whatever you feel comfortable using here. So as you can see, I'm just working my way along this horizon line, and popping in some lovely trees of various shapes and sizes. Ta-da! So by magic, more trees have appeared. So now I've gone along the whole horizon line. You can see I've used such light paint that they've really softened in nicely into those dark marks we already put in along the horizon. So all I'm doing now is I've just darkened up my paint a little bit, and I'm just carefully popping in some extra trees to just stand out amongst the forest, sort of bringing these ones into the foreground a little bit, just to get a bit of variety. So it's not all soft and misty. You want a few trees to just pop out against that background. So these are the ones that I'm pushing in now with slightly darker paint. So now I've let all those background trees dry nicely. I'm going to start work on the larger foreground trees. These are going to be one of the central sort of focal points of the painting. So bringing these into the foreground, I'm using some sepia to pop in the trunks, which is a lovely rich neutral brown colour, really nice. And now just bringing in some more Perylene Green, lovely rich dark forest green, and I'm going to use that for the boughs of the tree. So just using the round brush again with plenty of paint, just going along that central trunk and doing these light little sort of branches, pulling outwards, trying to make sure they're not too regular or regimented. We want it to look really nice and natural. So now it's just a matter of repeating that same process over and over again until you have as many trees as your heart desires. I've gone for 5 sort of main trees in this painting, but you could do more or less if you'd like a more sharper focus point. But again, just using that lovely long line of sepia for the central trunk, and then just bringing out the branches on either side. And because we're using such lovely rich dark paint here for our trees, this helps to place them very definitively in the foreground of the painting. It contrasts nicely against the really soft paint that we use to do the background trees, and you can see now we're putting in these bold ones that the others have just softened really nicely into the background to look really natural as part of a forest in the distance. So this for me is going to be the last of our large bold foreground trees. I'll just show you painting this last one as it's just set slightly behind that big fellow on the right. So all I'm doing is just making sure that I don't go over the lines that I've already made, just being quite careful with those lower branches and just sort of popping them in behind the ones that I've already done, and then just working my way upwards as per usual. It's a lovely simple technique to get really lovely, quite realistic looking conifers, I think. Lovely and tall and elegant these trees are today. Sometimes my trees turn out very flat and squat and very short, but I'm quite pleased with how these ones have turned out. So again, just taking care and using really sort of tiny little delicate strokes to make sure we don't overlap these branches too much, that it looks natural, that our far right tree here just pops in behind the big fellow next to it. We get those lovely sort of overlapping boughs which don't look too sort of messy and tangled and tend to sometimes end up as one big blob of paint. So now that our trees are done, I'm going to pop in a little bit of detail along the lakeshore. I'm using a liner brush here. This is a Pro Arte synthetic sword liner brush. You can tell by the shape of it. It's got this lovely curve which allows you to hold quite a lot of water in the brush and just go along and make these lovely thin strokes here. So I'm just going to use it to put along some reeds and some grasses around the base of our trees to sort of try and root them into the landscape. And you can see as well, just by tapping it on its side, you get these lovely sort of almost dotted lines of paint that you can use to create movement and shadow in the landscape as well. You can see I'm not worried about painting these reeds over our little egret we've got waiting there to be painted in, as we've still got the masking fluid on him, so we can just happily go and paint all around. So we've got these lovely reeds that are going to look like they're popping up behind him, because when we rub the masking fluid off, the white paper will still be there, so the reeds will be have that impression of being behind him on the other side of the other side. So all I'm going to do now is go around both sides of the lakeshore with the liner brush and do exactly the same thing, just pop in some detail and some texture using the liner brush and this dark paint, which is again a mix of Perylene Green and a little sepia added to it to give it a little bit of extra richness, just to give the impression of some light and shadow, some texture around this lakeshore. It's nice to always put some darker colours in there to really stand out. We've already got this lovely sort of misty marbled foreground, which gives the impression of some lovely sort of soft grasses and different sort of plants growing up around the lakeshore. But here we are, just hop forward a little bit, just so you didn't have to see me dabbing away for half an hour. And show you the last little bits, going around the lakeshore, creating perhaps a little bit of gravel, some rocks poking up here, or just some impression of some darker bits and bobs poking up out of this landscape, just giving us that extra little touch of detail in the foreground to just help bring this painting together. Now for a little extra bit of detail, I'm just going to very quickly use a texture brush here. You can use any sort of stippling brush or soft brush that you like, and just blobbing a little bit of really light paint just over these little spare bits in the foreground, just roughing it up a little bit, giving it a little bit of extra texture. This is going to dry quite pale again because I'm using quite diluted paint. This is also a skippable step if you don't have a texture brush, or if you just fancy leaving these bits lovely and clean and clear. But for me, I just wanted to just brush on a little bit of extra texture before starting on the bird. So everything's dry now. I must confess I used a hairdryer to give it all a quick blast to make sure everything was really nice and dry before removing the masking fluid from the paper. And as you can see, we've got our lovely white egret still there waiting to be painted in. Happy with that. So now I've switched to my fine detail brush. This is a very fine brush, grade 4/0, so really fine. It's a little synthetic brush from Pro Arte. They're very good. And all I'm doing is using a really pale blue colour to put in a little bit of detail and shadow around the bird's neck and wing. As this is a white bird, he really doesn't need too much doing to him. We already have that lovely bright white of the paper poking through. But if you're painting anything white, then it's a good idea to use a soft blue to create shadows that are going to give you that extra shape and dimension you want. So I'm just popping it in here around under the wing, where we would naturally get a shadow where the feathers don't quite lie flush with the bird's body, and just also on that back curve of the bird's neck, where there'd be perhaps a hint of shadow there as well. And as for the rest of the details, I'm simply going to use black. This is a little egret, so he doesn't have any yellow on him, unlike his bigger cousins. So lamp black I'm using, but obviously use whichever black you have in your palette. And just filling in with really careful, really fine strokes, a little black pointed beak, and just bring it slightly up for the eye. Their eyes are quite close to their beaks, and you often get this little shadow around them. So if you just bring that black up very slightly, just do a little round dot for the eye at this distance, That should be sufficient detail for our handsome little bird here. And again, just a couple of black lines for the legs, and you can see there I've also put in a little bit of a ripple in the water just underneath where his legs disappear in, just to give the impression of a little hint of movement there. As always with when you're doing a bird like this, especially one that's quite far away in the distance, it's really important just have that good outline, that good silhouette there. That does most of the work for you, and then you can just get away with filling in minimal details really, as long as you've got the colours right and the shape right. The viewer's eye will really do the rest. I'm going to pop a photograph of the pencil outline I used for this painting and for the bird up on my Patreon page, which I'll put a link to down below. If anyone's interested, that will be a downloadable on my Patreon page for anyone who would like to have a go at this one and not have to draw out your own bird. But for now, just going to finish up this painting with a lovely scattering of birds rising up from these distant trees and just creating a lovely sweep of movement going right to left across the edge of this painting. Now obviously these are not these are not egrets, perhaps a colony of jackdaws that's been disturbed out of their nest in the conifers, but that's my impression anyway. I'll leave it up to you what you think these little ones are. So here we have it, the finished painting. Thank you everybody for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it interesting, perhaps felt inspired perhaps to have a go at something similar yourself. So thank you again. I really enjoyed doing this one. Really loved that little bird. Really pleased with how this turned out. Again, I'll pop a list of all my equipment and colours down below in the video description, as well as a link to my Patreon page if you'd like to download this outline. Plus there's a whole bunch of other video tutorials on there, plus reference photos and all sorts of good stuff. So thank you again everybody for watching. I appreciate you viewing as always, and I can't wait to see you all again in the next video. Bye for now.